that there's a lot of films being made in experimental film by artists who were very underrepresented at that time in commercial film or even in like independent documentary. And so it's, as these films get seen again and people encounter them, we realize that the history of cinema is much richer perhaps than we expected. My name is Mark Toscano, and I'm a film preservationist in Los Angeles, and I specialize in experimental and artist-made cinema, independent films, documentaries. And to try to describe what film preservation is, it's a little difficult to summarize, but essentially it involves the conservation and the care of films, making new duplicates of them, new copies that can be screened, in order to extend the longevity, the life of the film, so people can see it in years in the future, hopefully. I get asked sometimes if there's a difference between restoring more conventional films like a narrative feature film or a more conventional documentary compared to restoring an experimental film. And of course there's some differences potentially. For instance, if I'm working with a Stan Brakhage film where he is literally painted directly on the film strip, I'm going to have to handle that differently than a regular photographic film. But actually in many ways it's a quite similar process. For any kind of film, you want to identify the best surviving original elements of the film. Hopefully you have the original negative. As an archivist, to work with the original negative is the best possibility we can hope for. And a negative is a negative in some ways, whether it's a huge feature film from Hollywood or a film made for $10 out of somebody's pocket, in the 1960s. It still needs to have a similar kind of care. And so, because we're working with different laboratories, both analog photochemical laboratories and also digital laboratories, there's a generally similar set of processes that will be used to restore or to work with films, whether they're very conventional narrative films or really crazy far-out experimental films. But perhaps the aesthetic and the philosophical side of it can be a bit more different. I think the expectation, very understandably, for most people is that everything is done digitally. And it's actually true internationally. A lot of archival work is done digitally. Even though film is this physical photographic object, of course you can scan it to digital and you can do restoration digitally. Quite powerful tools exist to do that. And this is amazing. This has completely changed my work and allowing me to restore some films that I could never restore with non-digital techniques before. But for me, especially with experimental film, because this kind of filmmaking more often is, I think, very aware of the material qualities of film, and also the history and the culture of exhibiting experimental films. It's very much connected to the medium, which is very frequently 16mm film, which was historically an amateur format that was embraced by artists and independent and low-budget filmmakers. And so it's a very special medium. And to continue to be able to see films on 16mm in their original format, to me, is just as important as preservation, period. You're also preserving an exhibition format, in a sense. Because I work in the United States, we still have some really good film labs there that I can work with. And the majority of the work that I do on experimental film is analog, like photochemical. It doesn't mean I'm anti-digital. I'm very pro-digital because it's incredibly powerful, and it has changed the way that I can restore some films that I couldn't restore before. But digital, to me, it's really important for access, and of course there are some places that can't show 16mm or can't show film, but this is a way they can still show the movies. But I think for me, it's really important to restore the films on film, because not only does that preserve them in a very stable medium, it's easy to forget that digital is really unstable and very expensive to maintain, actually, as a digital archive. It's incredibly complicated and expensive to have a digital archive. But not only that, because film is a very simple, very reliable preservation medium, but preserving the ability to see the films projected on film, I think, is very important and very special. Because I hate the idea that something is restored only digitally and then no one will ever again get to see it on 16 millimeter, and that seems a real shame to me. But of course, I can have that position because in the US, I do have access to film labs, and we have some funding to do this kind of work on film. With experimental film, to use that term, there are a lot of different factors, a lot of different contextual details that are very, very different than a conventional feature film that's meant to be seen in a movie theater or like streaming or whatever. Like where it will be seen and how it will be seen, how it should sound, how it should look. Sometimes these artists are working in a very different way with these factors. Like maybe they want it to be really loud and distorted, or they want the image to be very grainy, or things that we would normally consider problems in a more typical film. Sometimes they are embraced by the artists in experimental film as strengths or qualities of great beauty or meaning. At its essence, cinema is a medium about image and sound and time. And so you can do anything with that. It doesn't have to be storytelling necessarily. So for example, artists like Stan Brakhage or Jennifer Reeves, who are painting on film and then using some visual effects to rephotograph it and make all kinds of like incredible visual experiences out of abstract painting directly on a film strip. It may not be narrative in a typical sense, but it can potentially have great expression. Just like when we stand in front of an abstract painting and we might be moved by it, whether it's Rothko or Jackson Pollock or something like this, it has the capability to move us or to communicate with us in some way, even though it's not about an obvious form of storytelling. And so I really like that experimental film embraces all possibilities for the medium of film. It's very, very exciting for me to inspect the original negative for a film that has some crazy technique that the artist did, like sewing a thread directly into the film strip, or taping strange objects to it. Or in one example, a film by a guy named Rock Ross in San Francisco, he took the plastic bags that bread comes in the supermarket and tortillas and stuff, and he used an iron to iron the plastic bread bag directly onto the film strip. And so you see all these remnants of the color and the plastic and the text and the pictures from the bread bag on the film strip, and it's an amazing thing. And very playful, but like quite beautiful and strange as well. The reason why programming, like curating films, is really important to me as an archivist, I think has to do with the kind of films that I work on, which are these more independent and experimental films. I have worked on some more well-known films, like I worked on Grey Gardens, the Maysles Brothers documentary with Criterion as a collaboration. But once that's restored, Grey Gardens, it's a famous movie. It doesn't need like extra help for people to know about it and to discover it. It has enough of a reputation and people know it enough that it'll be fine in terms of its notoriety or its visibility. But experimental film often doesn't have that luxury. And so perhaps there's some artists like Stan Brakhage or Barbara Hammer, who I work with, that people do know their films and they're more well-known names. But actually the filmmaker Robert Nelson, who's somebody who's very important to me, kind of almost a mentor in some ways, he told me once, like saying that Stan Brakhage is the most famous experimental filmmaker is like saying he's the biggest ant on the anthill, because it's such a small world that a lot of people into film, like cinephiles, don't necessarily know a lot about what we call experimental film. So all of that said, I think programming plays a really important role in the archival process for experimental film, because it's the way that people can actually discover these works. Some of the stuff I work on, nobody's ever seen it, maybe since the first year it was made. And maybe most people have never even heard of the artist before. So there's no context for them to search for these films. And so for me, the programming side of the archival process is actually really, really important, because it's sometimes the only way that people might know about these films. And so I think whether it's me doing some programs, or I try to be in touch with curators who are interested in showing archival experimental film or restored experimental film, and let them know what I'm working on, and hopefully they'll show it. And I think not only is this an important part of the process because it provides access for audiences to see these films, and I think also to be quite inspired by them. But it has the genuine possibility of changing the way we're thinking about and relating to film history and cultural history, because there are artists that were doing work that is not remembered as well as some other artists, but maybe what they were doing was quite significant for their community. There's a filmmaker named Greta Snyder who I work with, who is a wonderful San Francisco filmmaker, and yeah, some of her films have been about documenting like very particular American subcultures and just activities in those subcultures, like amateur or pirate radio, or the punk scene, the hardcore scene, you know, people traveling on trains, like riding rails, you know, like all kinds of stuff, like really amazing stuff that nobody else maybe was documenting. And so for these films to be seen again by audiences who might not be familiar with them, they're also exposed to not just the film, but what the film is depicting and documenting, and it might change how they understand like what's happening in the late 80s in San Francisco or whatever. Experimental film, independently made film was an area that artists could work in where there were, earlier than in the commercial industry, commercial film industry, there were opportunities for women, for queer artists, for artists of color to work independently in film without having to, you know, deal with a studio or something. You find that there's a lot of films being made in experimental film by artists who were very underrepresented at that time in commercial film or even in like independent documentary. And so it's, as these films get seen again and people encounter them, we realize that the history of cinema is much richer perhaps than we expected. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't as controlled and as conservative in experimental filmmaking because there were much fewer rules about who could make a film. And so I think this is also a really important thing that programming helps, you know, for us to realize just the diversity of expression in film as well.